Long before the name Borgia became associated with poisoned cups, secret chambers, ruthless princes, and one of the most controversial popes in history, it belonged to a family far from Rome. They were not born among the ancient palaces of Italy. They did not begin as one of the great dynasties of Europe. They had no kingdom, no imperial army, no centuries-old claim to a throne. Their story began beneath the warm sun of Valencia on the eastern coast of the Iberian Peninsula, among families whose ambitions were still small enough to fit within the boundaries of a provincial town. And yet, within little more than a century, the Borgias would place two members of their family on the throne of St. Peter. They would enter the courts of kings. They would command armies. They would arrange marriages with some of the most powerful families in Italy. They would accumulate fortresses, territories, titles, wealth, and enemies. One Borgia would become pope. Another would exchange a cardinal's robes for a soldier's armor and attempt to carve a state of his own from the heart of Italy. A Borgia daughter would be married again and again as alliances shifted around her, only to outlive much of the scandal attached to her name and become one of the most fascinating women of the Renaissance. And all around them would gather stories. Stories of ambition, stories of betrayal, stories of murder, forbidden desire, and poison. Some were true, some were exaggerated, and some were created by enemies who understood that destroying a family's reputation could sometimes be easier than defeating its armies. By the time the Borgias disappeared from the center of Italian power, it would become almost impossible to separate the family itself from the legend that grew around it. Tonight, we will try. Slowly, quietly, one generation at a time. So settle comfortably now. Allow the noise of the day to fade into the distance. Imagine the warm stone streets of 15th century Valencia, long before Rome learned to fear the name Borgia. There is no need to remember every date, no need to hold every title in your mind. Simply follow the family. One person will lead naturally to another, one ambition will open the door to the next. And if sleep finds you somewhere along the way, let the story continue quietly without you. There will always be another night. For now, we begin not with Cesare, not with Lucrezia, not even with the famous Pope Alexander VI. We begin with the man who opened Rome's doors to them all. His name was Alfonso de Borja. And without him, there may never have been a House of Borgia as history remembers it. Alfonso was born in 1378 in the Kingdom of Valencia, then part of the wider crown of Aragon. The family name was Borja. Only later, when members of the family entered the Italian world, would that name take the form history remembers best. Borgia. The difference seems small. Only a few letters changed by language, but in time, the Italian version would become one of the most recognizable family names of the Renaissance. Alfonso's beginnings gave little indication of what was to come. He was not born the heir to a great duchy. He was not raised in a royal palace. His family possessed local standing, but nothing resembling the power later generations of Borgias would command. If Alfonso wanted to rise, inheritance alone would not carry him. He needed another road, and the road he chose was education. Alfonso studied law and became known for his ability as a jurist. This mattered. The medieval church was not only a religious institution, it was also a vast political and administrative world. Bishops governed the states, cardinals advised rulers, church officials negotiated treaties, judged disputes, managed money, and moved constantly between sacred responsibilities and secular power. A clever lawyer who understood both royal government and ecclesiastical authority could become extremely useful. Alfonso became exactly that. His abilities eventually brought him into the service of the kings of Aragon. And among those rulers, the most important for Alfonso's future was Alfonso V of Aragon. The king was ambitious. His interests stretched across the Mediterranean and deep into Italy. Above all, he wanted Naples. The Kingdom of Naples was wealthy, strategically important, and endlessly contested. Possession of it could make a Mediterranean ruler enormously powerful. But Italian politics were rarely simple. Kings, popes, princes, republics, and mercenary commanders all competed for advantage. An alliance made in spring might be broken by autumn. A marriage could change the balance of power. A papal decision could strengthen one claimant and ruin another. And in that world, a skilled diplomat was worth far more than 100 flattering courtiers. Alfonso de Borgia became such a diplomat. His work brought him closer to the difficult relationship between the Aragonese crown and the papacy. And as he successfully navigated those negotiations, his own position improved. The lawyer from Valencia was becoming a churchman of consequence. Eventually, he was made Bishop of Valencia. Then, in 1444, Pope Eugene IV raised him to the College of Cardinals. It was an extraordinary transformation. The son of a comparatively modest Valencian household had entered the small circle of men from whom popes were chosen. But Alfonso was already growing older. He was in his 60s. He had spent most of his life as a lawyer, diplomat, and administrator. There was little reason to imagine that he stood at the beginning of a dynasty. There was even less reason to imagine that he himself would become pope. Then, in 1455, Pope Nicholas V died. The cardinals entered conclave. Rome waited. And, as so often happened in papal elections, the most obvious candidates became trapped by their own strength. Powerful Italian factions distrusted one another. Great families watched carefully. The Orsini had their interests. The Colonna had theirs. Different cardinals had allies, enemies, promises, and ambitions. A candidate strong enough to satisfy one faction might be strong enough to terrify another. When powerful men cannot agree on which powerful man should win, they sometimes turn towards someone who appears less threatening. Alfonso de Borja was elderly. He was respected, experienced, and perhaps most importantly, he did not appear likely to establish a long pontificate. He could be a compromise, a temporary solution. A man everyone could accept because few believed he would have enough time to transform the balance of power. On the 8th of April, 1455, Alfonso de Borja was elected pope. He took the name Calixtus III, and with that decision, everything changed. A Valencian family that had once lived far from the center of European affairs suddenly possessed something almost no secular noble house could match. They had a pope. For the Borgias, Rome was no longer distant. Rome was opportunity. And family followed opportunity. Calixtus III entered the papacy with serious priorities of his own. Only 2 years earlier, Constantinople had fallen to the Ottoman Turks. Across Christian Europe, the shock had been immense. The old Byzantine capital, which had endured for centuries, was now in Ottoman hands. Calixtus became deeply concerned with organizing resistance and promoting a new crusade. But the Pope also faced another problem: trust. The papal court was crowded with men who owed their positions to previous popes, old Roman families, and competing Italian interests. Calixtus was a foreigner in Rome. He spoke differently. He came from Valencia. And many Italians regarded the growing number of Catalan and Valencian figures around him with suspicion. So, like many Renaissance rulers before and after him, he turned toward the people whose loyalty he believed he could depend upon: his own family. Among the relatives whose futures were transformed by Calixtus's election was a young nephew who had been born in Zativa in 1431. His name was Rodrigo. Rodrigo was the son of Isabel de Borja, Alfonso's sister. Through his mother, the future of young Rodrigo was tied directly to the uncle who now occupied the papal throne. Rodrigo had already been moving toward an ecclesiastical career. His uncle had helped provide opportunities for him while still a cardinal. The young man studied law, eventually attending the University of Bologna, one of Europe's great centers of legal learning. It was excellent preparation, because Rodrigo's greatest talent would not be theology, it would be power. He possessed an instinct for administration, relationships, negotiation, wealth, and survival. Traits that could take a man very far in Renaissance Rome. And now his uncle was pope. The transformation was rapid. In 1456, while Rodrigo was still only in his mid-20s, Calixtus III made him a cardinal. To understand the significance of this, it helps to forget the image of a quiet, elderly churchman that the word cardinal may suggest today. In 15th century Rome, cardinals could be political giants. They controlled enormous incomes, maintained households, built palaces, negotiated with kings, influenced elections, accumulated clients and allies. And most importantly, when a pope died, it was the cardinals who gathered to choose the next one. Rodrigo Borgia had entered one of the most exclusive political institutions in Europe, and he was only beginning. The following year, 1457, he received an office that would become the foundation of his long career: Vice-Chancellor of the Roman Church. It was one of the most important administrative positions in the papal government. Documents passed through the machinery of the chancery. Appointments, privileges, legal acts, and official correspondence required administration. Information flowed through it, and where information flowed, influence followed. The office was also extremely lucrative. Rodrigo would hold it not merely through his uncle's pontificate, but under a succession of later popes. That fact is worth remembering, because it is easy to imagine Rodrigo Borgia as a man whose entire career was simply handed to him by a powerful relative. His uncle certainly opened the door. There can be no serious doubt about that. But Calixtus III would not remain alive long enough to protect Rodrigo for the next 3 decades. Rodrigo would have to survive without him. And survive he did. For now, however, the Borja family seemed almost unstoppable. Another relative, Pedro Luis de Borja, Rodrigo's elder brother, also received extraordinary favor. He was given important secular responsibilities and became connected to the military authority of the papal government. Other Valencians entered positions around the Pope. To supporters of Calixtus, this may have looked like the natural construction of a loyal administration. To many Romans, it looked like an invasion. The resentment grew quietly at first. A foreign pope was filling Rome with foreigners. Ancient Italian families watched positions move into unfamiliar hands. Men who had spent years waiting for advancement saw Borgias and their allies rise with astonishing speed, and resentment is one of the most important forces in this family's history. The Borgias would become extremely good at gaining power. They would become much less successful at convincing others to forgive them for having gained it. There was another difficulty. Calixtus was old. A papal family could rise very quickly, but unlike a hereditary monarchy, papal power came with an expiration date. A king died and usually left his crown to his son. A pope died and his relatives could lose everything before the funeral ceremonies were complete. Every papal dynasty lived beneath that shadow. The family had to gain as much as it could while its protector was alive, and then it had to find some way to survive once he was gone. For the young Rodrigo Borgia, this would become the first great test of his life. Calixtus III had been pope for only a little more than 3 years when his health failed. In August of 1458, he died. Rome changed almost immediately. The protection surrounding the Borgias disappeared. The anger that had accumulated during the pontificate no longer needed to remain quiet. Anti-Catalan feeling erupted. People associated with the late pope suddenly found themselves vulnerable. Positions that had seemed secure became dangerous. Pedro Luis de Borja, who had risen so quickly under his uncle, was forced to flee Rome. The family's first great moment of power appeared to be collapsing almost as quickly as it had begun. Think for a moment about Rodrigo's position. He was 27 years old. His uncle, the man who had raised him into the College of Cardinals, was dead. His brother's power was disintegrating. The city contained men who resented his family. A new pope would soon be chosen. And that new pope would have no obligation whatsoever to continue rewarding the relatives of the man who had come before him. Rodrigo could have fallen with the rest. He could have returned to Spain. He could have become another brief beneficiary of papal nepotism, remembered only because fortune had once smiled upon his family. Instead, he stayed. And this is where the true Borgia story begins. Because Calixtus III had given Rodrigo power, but now Rodrigo would have to learn how to keep it. He would serve one pope, then another, then another. He would accumulate wealth, build alliances, father children despite the expectations attached to his position. Watch conclaves from inside the room where popes were made. And for 34 years after the death of the uncle who had opened Rome to him, Rodrigo Borgia would wait, patiently, carefully, never very far from the center of power. When the cardinals gathered after Calixtus's death, they elected Enea Silvio Piccolomini, who became Pope Pius II. Rodrigo had supported his election. The new pope did not sweep him aside with the rest of the old Borgia establishment. Most importantly, Rodrigo remained Vice-Chancellor of the Roman Church. The office would become the great anchor of his career. Popes would come, popes would die, factions would rise and disappear. But Rodrigo remained behind the machinery of papal government, learning how power moved through Rome, and, just as importantly, learning where it stopped. For a young man who had suddenly lost the uncle responsible for his fortune, this was a remarkable survival. And survival would become one of Rodrigo Borgia's greatest talents. He was not a man who needed every battle to end in immediate victory. He could wait, he could flatter, he could negotiate. He could lose a contest today and remain close enough to win something tomorrow. There are families in history whose power came from the sword. Others built fortunes through land, others through marriage. The Borgias would use all of these eventually. But Rodrigo first learned another kind of power, the power of remaining in the room. Rome in the late 15th century rewarded such patience. The city was the spiritual center of Western Christianity, but it was also a political marketplace. Ambassadors arrived carrying instructions from kings. Noble families competed for papal offices. Cardinals maintained enormous households. Princes requested favors. Bishops sought appointments. Petitions crossed desks. Money changed hands. Marriages were discussed in rooms occupied by churchmen. Military campaigns were planned within sight of churches. The sacred and the political existed side by side, often so closely that separating them became difficult. Rodrigo understood that world very well. His position as vice-chancellor gave him influence. His church benefices gave him income. And over the years, he accumulated enough of both to live with a magnificence that attracted attention even in a city accustomed to wealthy cardinals. He enjoyed fine surroundings. He entertained. He cultivated relationships. And he possessed a personality that made him difficult to ignore. Even writers hostile to him acknowledged his intelligence and political skill. He could be charming when charm was useful, persuasive when persuasion was required, patient when patience promised a greater reward. But Rodrigo's private life also began attracting attention. In 1460, reports reached Pope Pius II concerning Rodrigo's behavior at a gathering in Siena. Pius wrote a severe letter of rebuke. The accusation was not simply that a young cardinal had attended a celebration. The Pope believed the behavior there had crossed the boundaries expected of a prince of the church. Women had attended, there had been dancing, rumors circulated. Rodrigo apologized. Accounts differ over exactly what happened and how far later retellings embellished the scene. What matters is that Rodrigo's reputation was developing long before he became pope. He was ambitious, wealthy, worldly, and he did not live the private life reform-minded Christians expected from a senior churchman. The contradiction would follow him for the rest of his life. Yet it would be too simple to tell the story as though everyone around Rodrigo were pure while he alone introduced corruption into Rome. History was not so convenient. Nepotism was widespread. Cardinals could be princes as much as priests. Great Italian families competed fiercely for church offices. Political bargaining surrounded papal elections. Rodrigo was remarkable not because he invented this world, he was remarkable because he became exceptionally good at operating inside it, and he had time to learn. Pius II died in 1464. Another conclave followed. Another pope came, Paul II. Then Paul II died in 1471. Another conclave, another pope, Sixtus IV. Then after Sixtus, Innocent VIII. Through all of them, Rodrigo remained. For more than 3 decades after his uncle's death, he served at the highest levels of the Roman Curia. The young nephew, who might once have been dismissed as the fortunate creation of Calixtus, the third gradually became something far more dangerous to his rivals. An institution in his own right. He knew the cardinals, he knew the ambassadors, he knew which families hated one another, he knew which promises mattered, which men wanted money, which wanted titles, which wanted protection, which wanted their nephews promoted, and which wanted nothing more than to prevent an enemy from receiving the same favors. Every conclave taught him something. Every pontificate widened his network. Every year made him richer, older, more experienced, and more difficult to remove. By the 1470s, another part of Rodrigo's life had become increasingly important. Family. One woman became central to the Borgia household. Her name was Vannozza dei Catanei. We do not know the exact circumstances in which Rodrigo and Vannozza first met. History often preserves agreements between kings more carefully than the beginnings of private relationships. What survives clearly is the result. Vannozza became Rodrigo's long-term mistress, and together they had 4 children whose names would become inseparable from the Borgia legend. Cesare, Giovanni, often called Juan, Lucrezia, and Gioffre. Cesare was born around 1475 or 1476. Giovanni followed around the same period. Lucrezia was born in 1480. Gioffre came soon afterward. These 4 children would become the heart of the next generation. But at the time of their births, their futures were far from obvious. Their father was a cardinal, powerful, certainly. Rich, unquestionably. But he was not a hereditary king. He had no crown to pass to an eldest son, no kingdom that automatically belonged to his children. Yet Rodrigo did not treat them as mistakes to be forgotten. He planned for them. That decision would change the history of the family. Cesare was directed toward the church. It was the sensible route. If Rodrigo's influence remained ecclesiastical, placing one son within the same structure could preserve Borgia power across another generation. Cesare was educated carefully. Church benefices and future offices could provide income, status, and influence. But there was something about Cesare that would eventually make a quiet church career seem almost absurdly unsuitable. That would become clear later. For now, he was the son chosen for the church. Giovanni's future pointed elsewhere. Where Cesare could represent ecclesiastical power, Giovanni could continue a secular Borgia line. The family possessed interests in Spain, particularly around Gandia. Titles and marriages could turn Rodrigo's children from the acknowledged offspring of a cardinal into landed nobility. This distinction mattered, because Rodrigo was beginning to think not merely as a father, he was thinking as the founder of a dynasty. And then there was Lucrezia. Born in 1480, she entered a world in which noble daughters could become some of the most valuable political assets a family possessed. A daughter's marriage could make peace, seal an alliance, gain land, bring a dangerous enemy closer, or be discarded when an alliance was no longer useful. Lucrezia was still a child. She had no way of knowing how many times the ambitions of the men around her would rearrange her future. She would become perhaps the most famous woman ever to bear the Borgia name, and perhaps the most unfairly remembered. Centuries later, stories would transform Lucrezia into a poisoner, seductress, conspirator, and almost supernatural symbol of Renaissance corruption. The real woman would prove far more complicated. The youngest of the 4, Gioffre, would eventually become part of the family's southern Italian strategy. This was the Borgia method taking form. One child for the church, one for secular inheritance, one for marriage alliances, another available for whatever opportunity the complicated map of Italy might provide. It sounds cold when described that way, and perhaps sometimes it was, but such calculations were hardly unique to the Borgias. Great families across Europe arranged the lives of their children according to political need. What made Rodrigo different was the scale of what he would eventually attempt. He did not want merely comfortable futures for his children. He wanted greatness, and greatness required resources, so Rodrigo accumulated them. His Roman residence became a visible symbol of status. His wealth increased, his children were educated. Connections were cultivated in Spain and Italy, yet there remained something he did not possess. The thing from which nearly every later Borgia triumph would flow, the papacy itself. Rodrigo had watched men become pope. He had helped elect them. He had watched what happened to their families. He had watched nephews become princes. Papal relatives receive lands, offices, commands, marriages. And he understood the lesson. A cardinal could make his children wealthy. A pope could attempt to make them powerful enough to survive him. But the throne of St. Peter could not simply be inherited. Rodrigo had to wait for death, then survive a conclave, and convince enough men that their interests would be safer with him than with someone else. There was almost an opportunity in 1484. Pope Sixtus IV died. The cardinals entered conclave. Rodrigo was now experienced, enormously wealthy, and far more formidable than the 27-year-old who had watched his uncle's pontificate collapse. He had allies. He had influence. But 1484 was not his year. The conclave elected Giovanni Battista Cibo. He became Pope Innocent VIII, and Rodrigo did what Rodrigo had learned to do better than almost anyone. He remained. He did not destroy himself because another man had won. He did not retreat. He went back to work. There would be another conclave, eventually. All popes died, and Rodrigo Borgia knew how to wait. During Innocent VIII's pontificate, the political world around Rome grew no simpler. Italy remained divided among competing powers. The Kingdom of Naples watched the papacy. Florence watched Naples. Milan watched everyone. Venice guarded its interests. The great Roman families continued their old rivalries. Beyond Italy, the monarchies of France and Spain were growing stronger. And beneath all of these movements, cardinals continued the quiet business of building alliances for the future. Rodrigo was now approaching 60. His children were growing. Cesare was moving deeper into an ecclesiastical career. Giovanni's secular prospects were developing. Lucrezia was approaching the age when marriage negotiations would become politically useful. The Borgia pieces were beginning to take their places. Then, in July of 1492, Pope Innocent VIII died. Rome entered the strange interval that followed the death of every pope. The throne was empty. The old alliances loosened. Rumors moved through palaces, doors closed, private conversations multiplied. Ambassadors listened, servants carried messages. And the cardinals prepared to enter conclave. Rodrigo Borgia had waited 34 years since the death of Calixtus III. 34 years since the family had first tasted papal power. He had served beneath 4 popes. He had accumulated wealth, experience, friends, debts, enemies, and knowledge. He knew exactly what a papal election could do to a family. He had witnessed it as a young man when his uncle won. He had witnessed the destruction that followed when his uncle died. If Rodrigo entered this conclave and lost, life would continue much as before. He would remain wealthy, powerful, one of the great cardinals of Rome. But if he won, Cesare's future would change. Giovanni's future would change. Lucrezia's future would change. Gioffre's future would change. And the Borgia family would cease to be merely a powerful household. They would become the papal family. On the 6th of August, 1492, the conclave opened. The doors closed behind the cardinals. Outside, Rome waited. Inside were rival factions, old friendships, private promises, and ambitions accumulated over lifetimes. Among the candidates stood Rodrigo Borgia, the nephew who had survived his uncle, the foreign cardinal who had refused to leave, the father who had spent decades quietly preparing his children for a future that did not yet exist. He was 61 years old, and after more than 3 decades of waiting, the greatest gamble of the Borgia family was about to begin. On the morning of the 11th of August, 1492, Rome awoke to news that would reshape the family forever. Rodrigo Borgia had been elected pope. He chose the name Alexander VI. The first Borgia pope had opened the door. The second intended to walk through it with his entire family. Rodrigo was no longer simply a cardinal with wealthy estates and influential friends. He was pope. His words could create cardinals. His decisions could strengthen rulers. His diplomacy could alter the balance among Italian states. His offices could enrich men who had previously possessed very little. And, most importantly, he now possessed opportunities for his children that even his enormous wealth as a cardinal could never have provided. The papal throne was not hereditary. Cesare could not simply inherit it. Giovanni could not become pope because his father had been pope. Lucrezia could not inherit papal territory, like the daughter of a secular king. And so Alexander faced the same problem that confronted every ambitious papal family. He had power, but that power might die with him. If the Borgias were to survive beyond his pontificate, he had to transform temporary papal authority into something more lasting. Land, titles, marriages, military commands, cardinalates, alliances, a dynasty built while time still allowed it. The conclave itself would become one of the most discussed papal elections of the Renaissance. Rodrigo entered it as one of the richest and most experienced cardinals in Rome. He also entered with opponents. One crucial figure was Cardinal Ascanio Sforza, brother of Ludovico Sforza of Milan. An understanding between Rodrigo and Ascanio helped strengthen the coalition that carried Borgia to victory. Contemporaries widely believed that offices, benefices, property, and promises played a role in securing votes. The charge of simony would follow Alexander throughout his pontificate. Later, writers sometimes presented the election as a simple auction in which Rodrigo bought the papacy. The truth requires more caution. Political bargaining certainly surrounded the conclave. Improper exchanges were widely alleged, but not every later sensational detail can be treated as unquestioned fact. What can be said with confidence is that Rodrigo Borgia emerged victorious from a deeply political election. For Rome, the result was dramatic. For the Borgia children, it was life-changing. Yesterday, Cesare had been the ambitious son of a cardinal. Today, he was the son of the Pope. Yesterday, Lucrezia's marriage mattered because of her father's influence. Today, her marriage could help shape papal foreign policy. Yesterday, Giovanni had a future in Spanish nobility. Today, papal armies and Italian territories might lie within reach. Every member of the family had moved upward without taking a single step. Their father had climbed for them. Alexander moved quickly. His first months as pope did not immediately resemble the nightmare his later reputation might suggest. Rome could be violent. Feuds between noble families were common. Armed retainers moved through streets. Banditry troubled papal territory. Alexander presented himself as a ruler capable of restoring discipline. He heard cases, reorganized parts of administration. And, for a brief period, the experienced vice-chancellor appeared to bring the administrative skill of his earlier career into the papacy. But another side of the new pontificate was already becoming visible. Family. Cesare was the obvious first beneficiary. He had been directed toward the church since youth. Now the pace accelerated. In 1493, Alexander VI made Cesare a cardinal. He was still a young man. The red hat placed him among the princes of the church and seemed to confirm the role his father had chosen for him. At least, that was the plan. Cesare was intelligent, educated, ambitious, confident. He had studied law, understood court politics, and had grown up watching his father survive among some of the most calculating men in Europe. But beneath the robes of the churchman, there appears to have been another temperament. Cesare admired power in more direct forms: command, territory, soldiers, action. A cardinal could influence rulers. Cesare would eventually discover that he wanted to be one. For the moment, another son would carry the sword. Giovanni Borgia, known in Spanish form as Juan, had been assigned a very different future. Where Cesare belonged to the church, Giovanni belonged to the secular nobility. The family possessed the Duchy of Gandia in Valencia. Giovanni became Duke of Gandia and married Maria Enriquez de Luna, connecting the Borgias more closely with Spanish aristocracy. To Alexander, Giovanni represented something precious: continuity. A legitimate secular Borgia line could produce children. Those children could inherit titles, possess lands, continue in a way that papal office alone could never guarantee. If Cesare represented influence within the church, Giovanni represented permanence outside it, and Alexander appears to have been deeply attached to him. That affection would one day bring the Pope extraordinary grief. But not yet. For now, the family was still rising. And then there was Lucrezia. She was 13 years old when her father's election transformed her into one of the most valuable brides in Italy. Before Alexander became Pope, other marriages had been considered for her. Those arrangements could now be discarded. The daughter of a cardinal and the daughter of a pope were two very different political prizes. Alexander needed allies. The conclave had shown him the value of the Sforza connection. So Lucrezia's future was redirected toward that family. The chosen husband was Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro. He belonged to a branch of the great Sforza family that controlled Milan. He was older than Lucrezia, already widowed, and possessed a strategically useful lordship on the Adriatic coast. This was not a marriage born from romance. It was a political bridge. Through Lucrezia, the Borgias strengthened ties with the Sforza. Through the Borgias, Giovanni Sforza tied himself to the new pope. On the 12th of June, 1493, the marriage was celebrated in the Vatican. There was ceremony, display, wealth. The 13-year-old daughter of Alexander VI had become the wife of the Lord of Pesaro. To an observer watching the festivities, it might have appeared that Lucrezia's future had been settled. It had not. Nothing involving a Borgia marriage was ever quite settled, while politics continued to move. Lucrezia's usefulness to her father did not end when she became a wife. It began. The alliance with the Sforza was valuable because the Sforza were useful. If they stopped being useful, the marriage itself might become a problem. And the same was true for her youngest brother. Gioffre Borgia was still very young, but he too could be married. Alexander's attention moved south, toward Naples. The Kingdom of Naples was one of the great prizes of Italian politics. Its rulers belonged to the Aragonese dynasty. Their relationship with the papacy was complicated. Popes possessed old feudal claims over Naples. Neapolitan kings needed papal recognition. Roman and Neapolitan politics were therefore bound together by cooperation, suspicion, and periodic hostility. Marriage once again offered a solution. The bride was Sancha of Aragon. She was an illegitimate daughter of Alfonso of Calabria, who would soon become King Alfonso II of Naples. The groom was young Gioffre Borgia. In 1494, the marriage connected Alexander's youngest son directly to the ruling House of Naples. Look at what Alexander had constructed in less than 2 years. Cesare wore the red hat of a cardinal. Giovanni possessed the Duchy of Gandia and a Spanish aristocratic marriage. Lucrezia was tied to the Sforza. Gioffre was tied to the rulers of Naples. One child reached into the church, one into Spain, one toward Milan, one toward Naples. The Borgia family was becoming a web. Alexander sat at its center. But webs are fragile when the branches to which they are attached begin moving in opposite directions. Beyond the Alps, another king had begun looking south toward Italy. His name was Charles VIII of France. Charles was young, ambitious, and he believed he possessed a claim to the Kingdom of Naples. For years, such claims could exist mostly on paper. Kings claimed lands they did not control. Genealogies were recited. Old treaties invoked. Diplomats argued. Nothing necessarily happened. But Charles intended to do more than argue. One Italian ruler was prepared to encourage him, Ludovico Sforza of Milan. Ludovico had his own reasons. He ruled Milan in place of his young nephew and had no desire to surrender authority. Naples complicated his position because the Neapolitan royal family had reasons to oppose him. A French invasion aimed at Naples might solve several problems at once. So the door was opened, and once opened, it would prove very difficult to close. For Alexander VI, this was dangerous. His daughter was married to a Sforza. His youngest son was married into the Aragonese House of Naples. The two alliances designed to strengthen the Borgias were drifting toward opposite sides of an approaching war. This is one of the central patterns of the Borgia story. Their marriages were powerful tools, but every alliance created an obligation. And when alliances changed, Yesterday's advantage could become tomorrow's trap. Giovanni Sforza found himself in an uncomfortable position. He was Lucrezia's husband, Alexander's son-in-law, but also part of the Sforza political network. His relatives in Milan were moving toward France. His father-in-law in Rome was moving toward Naples. Loyalty to one side could look like betrayal to the other. The Borgias had reached higher than ever. But the ground beneath them was beginning to shift. Cesare watched all of this closely. The young cardinal had spent his life inside the church because that was the role his father had chosen. But the political world around him was becoming increasingly military. Kings prepared armies, Italian princes hired mercenaries, fortresses mattered, territory mattered. Men who could command soldiers were becoming more important every month. Cesare could wear a cardinal's robes. But Giovanni had a duchy, a noble marriage, and the possibility of military command. It is impossible to know every private thought that passed between the brothers. Later rumor would fill the silence with jealousy and hatred. Much of that material must be handled cautiously, but the difference in their positions is clear. Cesare had been assigned to the church. Giovanni had been assigned the secular future of the dynasty. Soon, the entire plan would be rearranged. In September of 1494, Charles VIII crossed the Alps into Italy. He did not come as a pilgrim. He came with an army. And the army was unlike anything many Italian states had confronted in generations. France possessed heavy cavalry, professional soldiers, and powerful mobile artillery capable of battering fortifications. Italian rulers had long trusted for protection. Cities that expected sieges measured in months could suddenly imagine walls broken in days. French troops moved south. The balance of the peninsula began to collapse. Rulers reconsidered alliances, old friends grew nervous, enemies became useful. And Alexander VI discovered that being pope did not make him master of events. Sometimes it simply placed him at their center. The French king wanted Naples. To reach Naples, he had to pass through the Italian world, over which Alexander claimed spiritual authority and considerable temporal power. Rome lay in his path. For the first time since becoming pope, Alexander faced an enemy he could not control through marriage, office, or carefully negotiated promises. Charles VIII had thousands of armed men behind him. By the closing weeks of 1494, the sound of the French advance was no longer something Rome could ignore. Fortresses surrendered, cities opened their gates. Rulers who expected months to negotiate discovered they had days. Directly between Charles and Naples stood Rome. Alexander attempted diplomacy, looked for allies, searched for some arrangement capable of stopping or redirecting the French advance, but every week made the problem more difficult. Roman barons who opposed Alexander sensed opportunity. The Colonna family favored the French cause. The Orsini could not be trusted. Even Rome's population could not necessarily be counted upon to resist a king surrounded by soldiers. Alexander possessed authority. Charles possessed something more immediately convincing: an army. By late December, the Pope could no longer prevent the inevitable. On the 31st of December, 1494, Charles VIII entered Rome. He was received not as a defeated enemy, but as a victorious king whose soldiers already stood inside the city. Imagine the scene quietly. Rome, the city from which Alexander had once seemed to control so many lives, was filled with foreign troops. French banners moved beneath ancient walls. Armored soldiers occupied quarters a short distance from the palaces of cardinals. The Pope remained the spiritual head of Western Christianity. But for those days, the distinction between spiritual authority and military power could hardly have been clearer. Among the men traveling with Charles were enemies of Alexander. One of the most dangerous was Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere. Della Rovere had opposed Rodrigo for years. He had supported the French expedition and had every reason to hope Charles might weaken, perhaps even remove the Borgia Pope. Alexander therefore faced something worse than invasion. He faced the possibility that his enemies might use the invasion to challenge the legitimacy of his pontificate. The accusations surrounding the election of 1492 had never disappeared completely. Now, with a French king inside Rome and hostile cardinals near him, rumors circulated that Alexander might be forced before a council or challenged over the validity of his election. For a man who had spent more than 30 years climbing toward the papal throne, the danger was unmistakable. He could lose everything. Not gradually, not over decades, in days. Alexander did what he had done throughout his long career. He negotiated. The talks were difficult. Neither side trusted the other. Charles wanted freedom to march south, guarantees that the Pope would not organize resistance behind him. Political concessions. Alexander wanted Charles out of Rome. And, above all, he wanted to remain Pope. The agreement reached in January 1495 was harsh for Alexander. Charles received passage through papal territory, and Cesare Borgia was to accompany the French king as papal legate. Officially, he traveled with honor. In reality, his presence served another purpose. Cesare was a hostage. If Alexander betrayed Charles while the French army marched south, the Pope's own son would be in the king's hands. Cesare was still a cardinal. He wore the robes of the church. But now, for the first time, he was physically drawn into the dangerous military world that would later define him. On the 25th of January, Charles left Rome and resumed his march toward Naples. Cesare went with him. For Alexander, it was humiliating. He had raised his children to extend his power. Now one of those children had become security for his obedience. For Cesare, however, the journey did not last long. At Valencia, south of Rome, he escaped. Later stories decorated the escape with disguises and clever tricks. The basic fact was simpler. Charles VIII had taken a Borgia as a hostage, and the Borgia had vanished. The escape humiliated the French king. But Charles did not turn back. Naples was too close. The French army continued south, and the kingdom Alexander had tried to protect began collapsing with astonishing speed. Charles entered Naples in February 1495. For a brief moment, the French king appeared overwhelmingly successful. He had crossed the peninsula, entered Rome, forced concessions from the Pope, reached Naples, and taken possession of the kingdom he claimed. What had seemed like an audacious expedition began to look like a transformation of Italy. And transformations frightened those who benefited from the old order. The speed of Charles's success changed everyone's calculations. Italian rulers who had once found France useful began wondering what would happen if France simply refused to leave. Ludovico Sforza had helped create the invasion. Now even he had reason to fear it. Venice watched. Spain watched. The Holy Roman Emperor watched. And Alexander VI saw an opportunity. If the French king had become too powerful, then fear of France could create the alliance that fear of invasion had failed to create earlier. In March 1495, a coalition formed. Alexander VI, Venice, Milan, Spain, and Emperor Maximilian. Its purpose was unmistakable. Charles VIII had to be contained. Only months earlier, French soldiers had entered Alexander's city. He had negotiated under pressure, sent his son with Charles as a hostage. Now he joined a coalition threatening the French king's road home. This was not consistency, it was survival. And survival was something Rodrigo Borgia understood very well. Charles began moving north again. In July, French and League forces met at Fornovo. The battle was confused and bloody. Charles continued north and eventually returned toward France. His invasion had failed to establish lasting domination. But Italy would never be quite the same. The expedition opened the larger era of the Italian wars: France, Spain, the Empire, the Papacy, Italian states. All would struggle repeatedly over the peninsula. For the Borgias, the lesson was more personal. Alexander had survived. His enemies had not removed him. Charles had not deposed him. Cesare had escaped. The French entered Rome and then left it. The Pope remained on the throne. And Alexander emerged from the crisis with a clearer understanding of the world surrounding his family. A pope could not rely entirely on spiritual authority. A marriage could become useless when politics shifted. A fortress could matter more than a promise. An army could change the argument. and a family that wished to survive in Italy needed soldiers. This lesson had consequences, for one Borgia son in particular, Giovanni. The Duke of Gandia had always been intended to carry the secular future of the family. Alexander now began giving him military responsibilities. If papal territories were to be brought under firmer control, if rebellious barons were to be weakened, someone had to command papal arms. Cesare remained a cardinal. Giovanni was the son who could openly carry a sword. And one family around Rome increasingly became Alexander's target: the Orsini. For generations, the Orsini had been among the great Roman baronial houses. They possessed castles, estates, armed followers, political alliances, and the habit of behaving as though popes came and went while the Orsini remained. Alexander wanted their power broken. The conflict offered Giovanni the opportunity his father had planned for him: military command, territory, glory, perhaps even the beginning of a permanent Borgia principality in central Italy. But Giovanni's campaign would not bring the triumph Alexander expected. The beginning produced some successes. Several Orsini positions were taken, but the central fortress at Bracciano resisted. Winter weather made campaigning difficult. Then, in January 1497, papal forces met the Orsini near Soriano. The result was defeat. Giovanni escaped, but the campaign had exposed his limitations as a military commander. This was not the glorious beginning Alexander imagined. Giovanni remained his father's favored secular son. But somewhere beside him stood Cesare, a cardinal, older, ambitious, watching. At the same time, Lucrezia's first marriage was becoming increasingly inconvenient. Only a few years earlier, her union with Giovanni Sforza had served a clear purpose. The Sforza family had been useful. Milan had been powerful. But the French invasion changed everything. The Sforza had helped bring France into Italy. Alexander had moved closer to Naples. Lucrezia's husband now connected the Pope to a political arrangement he no longer needed. The marriage had become a chain. Alexander wanted it broken. For Giovanni Sforza, the change must have been frightening. A man who married the daughter of a pope could rise quickly. But if the Pope decided the marriage no longer served him, the same connection could become dangerous. Relations deteriorated. In March of 1497, Giovanni fled Rome and returned to Pesaro. Rumors claimed he feared for his life. The most sensational details are uncertain. What is clear is that Alexander wanted the marriage ended. There was a problem. Marriage in the eyes of the Church could not simply be discarded because an alliance had become inconvenient. A legal reason was required. The argument chosen was that the marriage had never been consummated. If husband and wife had never completed the union physically, it could be declared invalid. For Giovanni Sforza, the accusation was humiliating. To accept the annulment meant accepting a public claim that he had been incapable of consummating his marriage. He resisted, protested, and began spreading accusations of his own. It was during this struggle that some of the darkest stories surrounding Lucrezia began to take shape. Giovanni suggested that the Borgias wanted Lucrezia returned because of improper relationships within her own family. The accusation would grow over centuries into elaborate stories of incest involving Lucrezia, her father, and her brothers. There is no solid evidence supporting those claims. But once a story becomes famous enough, fame itself begins to look like proof. Lucrezia would spend centuries trapped inside stories created when she was still a teenager. The poisoner, the seductress, the woman at the center of a corrupt papal court. Yet at this point, the reality was simpler, and perhaps more tragic. She was 17 years old, and her father was ending one marriage so that he could arrange another. But before the annulment was complete, another crisis struck the family, and this one was far more personal. On the evening of the 14th of June, 1497, members of the Borgia family gathered for dinner at the home of Vannozza dei Catanei. The mother of Cesare, Giovanni, Lucrezia, and Gioffre had watched her children rise from the acknowledged offspring of a cardinal into the papal family of Rome. That evening began as a family gathering. It ended in disappearance. After dinner, Giovanni and Cesare left together. For part of the journey, they traveled in the same direction. Then Giovanni separated from the group. He sent most of his attendants away. A servant remained nearby. There was also, according to some accounts, a mysterious masked man seen in Giovanni's company. And then the Duke of Gandia vanished. At first, perhaps there was little panic. Giovanni was young, wealthy, known to enjoy the pleasures available to a nobleman in Rome. Perhaps he had gone to meet someone. Perhaps he simply did not wish to return before morning. But morning came. Giovanni did not. Hours passed, still nothing. The mood changed. Alexander began to fear something had happened. Searches were ordered, questions asked. Eventually a witness was found. A timber merchant who had been near the Tiber during the night reported seeing several men arrive beside the river with a body. They had thrown it into the water. The merchant had not raised an alarm. Rome was a violent city. Bodies entering the Tiber may not have seemed unusual enough to force every witness into action. Now the river was searched, and on the 16th of June they found Giovanni. The Duke of Gandia was pulled from the Tiber. He was still dressed. Money remained with him. Simple robbery seemed unlikely. His body bore multiple wounds. Someone had wanted him dead. Alexander VI was devastated. This was not a political inconvenience, not an alliance to renegotiate, not a rebellious baron to punish. His son was dead. The son on whom he had placed so many hopes had been murdered in the city Alexander himself ruled. Contemporary reports describe the Pope's grief as overwhelming. For days, the man famous for appetite, ambition, calculation, and resilience seemed broken. For a brief moment, something unusual happened. Alexander spoke as though Giovanni's death had forced him to examine his own life. He talked of reform, of correcting abuses in the church, of changing the behavior of the papal court. Perhaps grief had done what enemies failed to do. Perhaps, for a short time, Alexander truly believed his son's death was a warning. But grief changes, and power has its own demands. The reforms did not transform the papacy. The investigation faded, and the identity of Giovanni's killer was never established. Rome produced suspects. The Orsini had reasons to hate the Borgias. Political enemies existed throughout the city. Stories circulated involving romantic rivals, and eventually the most famous accusation fell upon Cesare. The story was irresistible. Two brothers, one forced into the church, the other given the military future. The secular brother murdered, the cardinal brother soon abandoning his ecclesiastical career and taking the sword. It formed an almost perfect narrative, perhaps too perfect. Later tradition increasingly blamed Cesare. Some historians have considered the suspicion plausible, but no surviving evidence conclusively proves that he ordered or committed his brother's murder. The case remains unresolved. Whatever Cesare knew, Giovanni's death transformed the future. The structure Alexander had built for his sons was broken. Giovanni had been the secular son. Now Giovanni was gone. The Borgia state Alexander imagined still needed someone capable of commanding armies, someone ambitious enough to attempt what Giovanni had failed to achieve. There was only one obvious candidate, Cesare. He was approaching his mid-20s, a cardinal since 1493. His ecclesiastical career had been extraordinary, but the red robes had never entirely contained him. Now the obstacle between Cesare and a secular future had disappeared. Meanwhile, Lucrezia's annulment moved forward. Giovanni Sforza eventually submitted. In December 1497, the marriage was formally declared null. Lucrezia was free, which meant, in the language of Borgia politics, that she was useful again. A new political world was also emerging beyond Rome. Charles VIII of France died in 1498. A new French king took the throne. Louis XII. Louis wanted his own marriage annulled so that he could marry Anne of Brittany. Alexander possessed enormous influence over that question. Alexander, meanwhile, wanted something from France, a future for Cesare. The possibilities were obvious. The Pope could cooperate with the king's matrimonial ambitions. The king could open the French court to Cesare. On the 17th of August, 1498, Cesare Borgia formally renounced the cardinalate. The son whom Alexander had intended to make a prince of the church would now attempt to become a prince in the most literal sense. It was an extraordinary act. Cesare was not leaving an insignificant office. He surrendered income, prestige, church benefices, and membership in one of the most powerful institutions in Europe. But leaving the church did not automatically give him an army, a kingdom, or a wife from a ruling house. It merely made those things possible. France would provide the next step. Cesare traveled with impressive display. Alexander wanted the French court to understand that this was not simply a disgraced former churchman. This was a man expected to become something greater. Louis XII granted him the county of Valentinois, raised to a duchy. From then onward, Cesare became widely known as the Duke of Valentinois. In Italian, the title became even more memorable, Il Valentino. The cardinal had disappeared. A duke had taken his place. He also needed a marriage. Alexander initially hoped for Carlotta of Aragon, daughter of the King of Naples, but the proposed match did not take place. France offered another solution, Charlotte d'Albret. She belonged to an important noble family and was sister to the King of Navarre. In May 1499, Cesare married Charlotte. The former cardinal now possessed a French duchy, a noble wife, and the favor of the French king. For a short time, Cesare and Charlotte lived together. A daughter would later be born from the marriage, but Italy was calling Cesare back, and when he returned, he would not come alone. Louis XII intended to invade Italy. French soldiers would cross the Alps again. Cesare would use that power for ambitions of his own. While Cesare transformed himself in France, Lucrezia entered her second marriage. The chosen husband was Alfonso of Aragon, Duke of Bisceglie and Prince of Salerno. He was connected to the royal family of Naples and brother to Sancha of Aragon, who was already married to Gioffre. The marriage tightened the connection between the Borgias and Naples. Lucrezia married Alfonso in July 1498. This second marriage appears to have been very different from the first. With Alfonso, surviving evidence suggests genuine affection developed. They were close in age. Alfonso was young and handsome. And for perhaps the first time in Lucrezia's life, marriage seems to have offered something beyond political usefulness. For a while, she may have been happy, but happiness inside the Borgia family had a way of becoming vulnerable to diplomacy. Because almost as soon as Lucrezia married into the Neapolitan dynasty, Alexander and Cesare turned increasingly toward France, and France was the great enemy of Naples. The contradiction could not last. Alfonso understood this. By the middle of 1499, Alexander's pro-French policy had made his position in Rome dangerous. He had married the Pope's daughter, believing the Borgias were allies of Naples. Now Cesare was a French duke. Louis XII was preparing to enter Italy. Alfonso became frightened. In August 1499, he fled Rome without Lucrezia. For Lucrezia, the departure was deeply personal. She was pregnant. Her husband had left. Once again, politics had entered her marriage. Alexander entrusted Lucrezia with administrative responsibility away from Rome, naming her governor of Spoleto and Foligno. This was significant. It is easy to imagine Lucrezia only as a daughter moved around by her father, but moments like this suggest something more complicated. She was being trusted with governance. She would increasingly demonstrate administrative ability and social intelligence. Eventually, Alfonso returned. The young couple were reunited, and in November 1499, Lucrezia gave birth to a son. He was named Rodrigo. For a moment, another branch of the family seemed secure, but Cesare was already moving toward Italy with very different plans. Louis XII crossed the Alps in 1499. His immediate target was Milan. France captured the duchy. Ludovico Sforza fled, briefly returned, and was ultimately defeated. French influence in northern Italy became enormous, and Cesare Borgia had attached himself to the winning side. His target was the Papal States. The lands nominally governed by the Pope were not a single tightly controlled kingdom. Across central Italy were cities and lordships ruled by families who acknowledged papal authority in theory while behaving with considerable independence in practice. Some failed to meet obligations to Rome, some changed alliances whenever convenient, some possessed fortresses, armies, and local dynasties of their own. To Alexander, this fragmentation represented weakness. To Cesare, it represented opportunity. If these lordships could be removed one by one, their territories could be brought under firmer papal control. And, perhaps, something more. Perhaps they could become the foundation of Cesare's own state. The first targets lay in Romagna, Imola, Forli. The cities were associated with Caterina Sforza, one of the most formidable women of Renaissance Italy. She was no passive ruler waiting for Cesare to arrive. Caterina had survived assassination, rebellion, siege, political chaos. She had defended her family's position before. She intended to defend it again. By the time Cesare approached, he was very different from the young cardinal Rome once knew. He possessed French support, artillery, mercenaries, money from his father, a ducal title, and something perhaps even more important: a clear purpose. Giovanni had once been given command because Alexander needed a soldier. Cesare wanted military authority for something larger. A city captured was not only a victory, it was revenue. A fortress, a road, a symbol, a place from which the next campaign could begin. This was how a state could be built, one town at a time, one defeated family at a time. Every victory would make the next surrender easier. Alexander supported the project by declaring that several Romagnol lords had forfeited their papal vicariates. Cesare could therefore present his campaigns not simply as private conquest, but as restoration of papal authority. It was an elegant arrangement. The Pope supplied legitimacy, France supplied military weight, Cesare supplied ambition. Together, father and son were attempting the most dangerous project in Borgia history. Not merely influencing Italy, taking part of it. Cesare appeared before Imola in November 1499. French support gave his army a strength many local lords could not easily match. Artillery had transformed siege warfare. Walls that once discouraged attackers for months could now be battered with sustained cannon fire. And Cesare understood that reputation could sometimes achieve what weapons had not yet begun. If one city surrendered quickly, the next might wonder whether resistance was worth the cost. Imola did not hold for long. By December, Cesare controlled the city and fortress. He then turned toward Forli. Caterina withdrew into the fortress of Ravaldino. The city itself could be lost. The fortress might still be defended. Behind stone walls in the cold months surrounding the beginning of the year 1500, two determined personalities prepared to test one another. Cesare outside, Caterina within. Forli came under Borgia control. Ravaldino continued to resist. The siege lasted into January. Eventually, overwhelming force prevailed. On the 12th of January, 1500, the fortress fell. Caterina was captured. The victory mattered beyond a single fortress. Cesare had demonstrated something Giovanni Borgia never had. He could succeed in the field. Alexander once placed the family's military future in Giovanni's hands. Giovanni had returned from the Orsini campaign without the victory his father desired. Cesare had gone into Romagna and taken cities. The comparison was impossible to ignore. With victory came reputation. The former cardinal was becoming a conqueror. And Cesare discovered the rhythm that would define the next years of his life. A papal declaration, a military march. Negotiation if surrender was possible, force if it was not. Then a new government, a new fortress, a new source of revenue, another target farther along the road. Each conquest increased his ability to make the next. This was how a territorial prince was created, not in a single ceremony, but city by city. As Cesare's position strengthened, another relationship inside the Borgia family became increasingly dangerous: Lucrezia's husband, Alfonso of Aragon. The political reason was straightforward. Alfonso represented Naples. Cesare increasingly represented the French alliance. The two directions were becoming incompatible. Lucrezia's marriage had been arranged when Alexander wanted closer relations with Naples. That moment had passed. Louis XII was now Cesare's great external supporter, but Alfonso was not merely an alliance written on paper, he was Lucrezia's husband. By most indications, she had become genuinely attached to him. They had a young son together. For Lucrezia, politics was again threatening something personal. On the evening of the 15th of July, 1500, Alfonso was attacked near St. Peter's in Rome. Armed men set upon him and left him badly wounded. He survived, barely. The identity of those who ordered the attack immediately became the subject of suspicion. Alfonso was carried to safety. Lucrezia came to him. So did his sister Sancha. They helped care for the wounded prince. For weeks, Alfonso slowly recovered. Imagine the atmosphere around his room. A young man had been attacked in the center of papal Rome. His father-in-law was the pope. His brother-in-law commanded armies, and yet protection seemed uncertain. People moved carefully. Visitors were watched. Food and medicine mattered. The political struggle surrounding Italy had somehow entered a sick room. Lucrezia had already watched her first marriage disappear because her family no longer needed it. Now she sat beside a husband who had nearly been killed, and somewhere in Rome was the person who had wanted him dead. Alfonso improved. For a time, it appeared he might survive the entire episode. But the danger had not passed. On the 18th of August, the end came. Men associated with Cesare entered the situation surrounding Alfonso. Those near his bedside were removed. Alfonso was strangled. Unlike the murder of Giovanni 3 years earlier, where responsibility remains unresolved, the historical tradition surrounding Alfonso's death points much more directly toward Cesare and his agents. The political explanation was easy to see. Alfonso had become inconvenient. The Borgias were committed increasingly to France. The Aragonese connection stood in the way. For Lucrezia, the consequences were devastating. Her husband had been useful, then inconvenient, then gone. She was 20 years old, twice married, once divorced, now widowed. Already, stories surrounding her name were becoming darker than the life she had actually lived. The death of Alfonso also marked something larger. The Borgias were changing. During the early years of Alexander's pontificate, family power had been built mostly through offices and marriages. Cesare's rise introduced another instrument, controlled violence. A city resisted. It could be conquered. A noble rebelled. He could be removed. An alliance became dangerous. The people associated with it could become vulnerable. This was not unique in Renaissance Italy. Assassination, warfare, betrayal, and sudden reversals were not Borgia inventions. But Cesare was beginning to combine them with a speed and concentration that frightened other rulers. Fear itself became useful. A prince believed to be ruthless sometimes needed less violence because opponents surrendered before violence became necessary. Cesare understood reputation, and his reputation was growing. After Imola and Forli, his campaigns resumed. The Romagna contained more lordships whose rulers Alexander declared to have lost their rights: Pesaro, Rimini, Faenza. Each carried another old family name. Each possessed its own history. Each could become another piece of Cesare's state. One name carried private irony: Pesaro, the domain of Giovanni Sforza, Lucrezia's first husband, the man whose marriage had been annulled after the Borgias decided he was no longer useful. Giovanni had escaped the family personally. His territory might not. Late in 1500, Pandolfo Malatesta abandoned Rimini. Giovanni Sforza was driven from Pesaro. Cesare's momentum increased, but Faenza proved more difficult. There, a young ruler named Astore Manfredi possessed something many of Cesare's previous enemies lacked: the affection of his people. The city resisted. Winter approached. The campaign slowed. For the first time in months, Cesare encountered a place that would not simply open its gates because his banners had appeared outside. Astore Manfredi was still only in his teens. The Manfredi family had governed Faenza for generations. Unlike some rulers Cesare displaced, Astore had genuine support among the population. This made the siege more difficult. A population willing to defend its ruler could turn simple conquest into a long and expensive struggle. The defenders held. Cesare's artillery battered the walls. Assaults were attempted. Negotiations followed. Still, Faenza resisted. For months, the young Manfredi held out against the most successful military force the Borgias had yet created. But resistance could not last forever. Cesare had money, men, artillery, and time. By April 1501, Faenza's position was hopeless. The city negotiated surrender. Astorre Manfredi gave himself into Cesare's hands. The terms appeared relatively generous. The young ruler was not immediately executed. He was taken away. Perhaps his supporters hoped he would simply be removed from power and allowed to live. But Astorre disappeared into Borgia custody. Later, a body identified as his was reportedly recovered from the Tiber. The exact circumstances remain uncertain, but Astorre Manfredi never returned to Faenza. Another old ruling family had vanished from Cesare's path. The message was difficult to misunderstand. Cesare Borgia was no longer merely defeating his enemies, he was replacing them. Faenza completed an extraordinary sequence of victories. The former cardinal now controlled much of the Romagna. Alexander VI rewarded him with a new title, Duke of Romagna. It was no longer enough to call Cesare Duke of Valentinois. He now possessed a title rooted in Italian territory he had actually conquered. A state was taking shape. Cesare began organizing administration, officials were appointed, taxes regularized, local disorder suppressed, roads and communication became important. The new duke understood that conquest alone could not preserve his achievements. A city terrified during a siege still had to be governed after the army moved on. This is one of the more complicated parts of Cesare's reputation. He could be ruthless, deceptive, willing to authorize violence. Yet he also understood that endless disorder weakened a ruler. In the Romagna, years of local feuds, rival families, mercenary violence, and weak government had produced instability. Cesare sought to replace that instability with obedience. Not freedom, not gentle government. Obedience. But obedience could sometimes feel like peace to people who had spent years living amid private wars. To establish that peace, Cesare selected men capable of imposing it. One was Ramiro de Locqua. Ramiro's task was simple in principle: bring order. In practice, order required force. Punishments were harsh, authority concentrated, local resistance crushed, fear worked. For a time, but fear creates another problem. People who hate an official may eventually begin hating the prince who appointed him. Cesare understood this too, and the way he eventually dealt with Ramiro would become one of the most famous episodes associated with him. That moment still lay ahead. For now, Cesare stood near the peak of his success. And while the Borgia son was turning conquered cities into a state, the Borgia daughter prepared to leave Rome. Lucrezia had been widowed, Alfonso of Aragon was dead. The marriage that tied the Borgias to Naples had ended in blood. Alexander VI was already searching for a third husband. This time, he looked toward Ferrara. The House of Este. The Este were not like the minor families Cesare had been driving from the Romagna. They were old, prestigious, established. They had ruled Ferrara for generations and possessed connections across the courts of Italy and Europe. A marriage between Lucrezia and the Este heir would be a major social victory for Alexander. It would say something important. The Borgias were no longer outsiders who had risen because one of them happened to become pope. They could marry into one of Italy's great dynasties. But the Este were not enthusiastic. The proposed husband was Alfonso d'Este, eldest son of Duke Ercole I of Ferrara. He would one day inherit the duchy. From the Este point of view, the match had obvious disadvantages. Lucrezia was the illegitimate daughter of a pope. Her first marriage had ended in humiliating annulment. Her second husband had been murdered in circumstances pointing toward her own brother. The Borgia reputation was growing darker. Ferrara had every reason to hesitate. Alexander had every reason to insist. Negotiations became intense. The Este demanded extraordinary financial concessions, a vast dowry, money, jewels, reductions in payments owed to the papacy. Political advantages. Alexander accepted demands that demonstrated how much he wanted the marriage. For Lucrezia, once again, her future was negotiated in rooms where other people decided what her value should be. But this third marriage would prove unlike the first two. The agreement was reached in 1501. Celebrations followed, and in January of 1502, Lucrezia left Rome for Ferrara. The departure carried emotional weight that politics alone cannot fully explain. Rome had been her home. Her father remained there. Cesare remained at the center of power. The city contained almost everything associated with the first 21 years of her life: privilege, marriage, scandal, grief, danger. Now she traveled north toward a court where many people distrusted her before she arrived. It might have been another trap. Instead, over time, Ferrara became the place where Lucrezia began to escape the legend others had constructed around her. Her husband Alfonso was not immediately affectionate. The Este court watched her carefully. Some members of the family had opposed the marriage. Lucrezia had to prove herself, and she did, slowly. She learned the rhythms of the Ferrare's court, cultivated poets and scholars, managed correspondence, participated in administration, took responsibility during her husband's absences, became involved in charitable and religious patronage, bore children, and the woman later remembered as the poisonous daughter of the Borgias gradually became a respected Duchess of Ferrara. That transformation would take years. For now, the important fact was simpler. Lucrezia had left Rome. She was finally beyond the immediate control of Alexander and Cesare. The House of Borgia was beginning to divide geographically. Alexander remained in the Vatican. Cesare moved between battlefields and conquered cities. Lucrezia built a new life in Ferrara. Gioffre remained tied to southern Italy. The family was still powerful, but it was no longer gathered beneath one roof. Distance can change relationships. It can also create independence. Lucrezia's departure came while Cesare moved toward greater ambitions. Romagna was not enough. His attention shifted toward central Italy: Urbino, Camerino, Bologna, Florence. The map surrounding his new state offered possibilities everywhere, but every expansion created fear. Cesare's military strength depended heavily on commanders who were not Borgias, men who possessed armies of their own, territories of their own, interests of their own. The great mercenary captains of Renaissance Italy were useful precisely because they already controlled military resources. That made them powerful allies. It also made them dangerous subjects. Among Cesare's commanders and associates were men such as Vitellozzo Vitelli, Oliverotto da Fermo, Paolo Orsini, Francesco Orsini, Duke of Gravina, and others connected to families that had every reason to wonder where Cesare's ambitions would stop. At first, serving him had been profitable. His victories created opportunities. His campaigns brought money. French support made him appear strong. Fighting beside a rising prince seemed safer than standing in his way. But then Cesare began taking territories. Not temporarily, permanently. And the men around him started asking a dangerous question. What happens when there are no enemies left for Cesare Borgia to conquer? The answer was uncomfortable. He might begin turning toward his allies. The Orsini understood this particularly well. Their family had already fought Alexander VI. The Pope wanted to reduce the independence of the great Roman barons. Cesare's expanding state made that threat more serious. Vitellozzo Vitelli had grievances of his own. Other commanders had reasons to worry, and Cesare gave them more. In June 1502, he moved against the Duchy of Urbino. Its ruler was Guidobaldo da Montefeltro, a respected prince, a man connected to some of the finest military traditions in Italy, and, significantly, a man who did not expect Cesare to attack when he did. Cesare relied on surprise. The campaign moved rapidly. Guidobaldo fled. Urbino fell. The conquest was impressive. It was also frightening. If Cesare could turn so suddenly on Urbino, what guarantee did any neighboring ruler possess? Camerino followed. Cesare's power seemed to spread every month, but the appearance of unstoppable growth concealed a new weakness. The speed of expansion was creating a coalition against him. His captains became nervous. His neighbors became nervous. Florence watched him. Venice watched. The Orsini watched. And men who had helped Cesare win battles began meeting without him. The conspiracy took shape at Magione near Lake Trasimeno in October 1502. Among those involved were leading condottieri and nobles who had served or cooperated with Cesare. They had decided that waiting for him to destroy them one by one was too dangerous. Better to move first. The conspirators discussed resistance, contacted enemies of the Borgias, encouraged rebellion in territories Cesare had conquered, and for the first time since the beginning of his campaigns, the Duke of Romagna faced something more dangerous than a fortress wall. Betrayal from inside his own military system. The rebellion produced immediate consequences. Urbino rose against Borgia rule. Guidobaldo returned. For a brief moment, Cesare's conquests began slipping away. His aura of inevitability cracked. The prince who frightened city after city suddenly appeared vulnerable. And vulnerability could spread faster than victory. If one city rebelled successfully, another might follow. If one commander abandoned Cesare, another might decide there was safety in joining him. The state he built so rapidly could collapse with equal speed. Cesare was short of reliable troops. French assistance was not always available in the numbers he required. Several commanders had turned against him. Some new territory was unstable. If the conspiracy remained united, it might destroy everything he had built. So Cesare did not attack it directly. He began to talk. Messages passed. Promises were made. Assurances offered. He acted as though reconciliation remained possible. He appeared willing to forgive. One by one, the men who rebelled began reconsidering. Perhaps Cesare was weaker than they feared. Perhaps compromise was safer than continued rebellion. Perhaps the Duke understood that he needed them. Perhaps everything could return to the arrangement that existed before Magione. Cesare encouraged them to believe exactly that. He restored conversations, accepted professions of loyalty, allowed mistrust to soften, and prepared a campaign against Senigallia. The town had strategic value. Cesare's former rebels could prove their renewed loyalty by helping him take it. They agreed. It seemed like reconciliation. The conspirators would return to Cesare's service. The Duke would forgive their rebellion. Together, they would continue the work of conquest. But Cesare had learned something from the conspiracy. These men feared that he would eventually turn on them. They had therefore tried to turn on him first. If he forgave them completely, they might simply try again when another opportunity appeared. And Cesare had never been a man who enjoyed leaving a dangerous problem unresolved. Before Senigallia, he provided one warning. Ramiro de Lorqua had been useful because he was severe. When Cesare took control of Romagna, he inherited territories weakened by feuds, robbery, competing jurisdictions, and years of instability. He needed order. Ramiro supplied it. His government became associated with harsh punishment and uncompromising authority. Fear worked, but hatred grew beside obedience. By late 1502, Ramiro's usefulness had become dangerous. A ruler could benefit from cruelty. He could also be blamed for it. Cesare chose another solution. On the 22nd of December, Ramiro was arrested at Cesena. 4 days later, the people of the city encountered a shocking display. Ramiro was dead. His body publicly exposed in the square. The message was difficult to miss. The harshness of government could now be attached to the dead minister rather than to the duke who appointed him. Cesare had used Ramiro to create order, then used Ramiro's death to separate himself from the fear that order had produced. Only days later, in the final days of December, the commanders who betrayed Cesare gathered near Senigallia. Vitellozzo Vitelli came. Oliverotto da Fermo came. Paolo Orsini came. Francesco Orsini came. Cesare approached as well. His behavior was calm, friendly, reassuring. There were embraces, greetings. No army immediately surrounded the men. No executioner waited visibly in the square. Everything suggested that the crisis had passed. The former rebels had reason to remain suspicious. They understood the man they were dealing with. They had fought beside him, watched him remove rulers from cities their families had governed for generations. They knew how quickly Cesare could transform friendship into hostility. And yet they needed him. The conspiracy had not destroyed Borgia power. French support had not vanished. Alexander VI remained pope. Cesare still controlled much of Romagna. The rebels had discovered that opposing him was dangerous. Returning to him appeared dangerous as well. They chose the danger they believed they could manage. Cesare encouraged them to believe they had chosen correctly. On the 31st of December, 1502, Cesare entered Senigallia. The conspirators rode out to greet him. There were embraces, courteous words, signs of reconciliation. Nothing in Cesare's manner needed to suggest that the day would end differently from any other meeting between a prince and his captains. But he had taken precautions. Loyal men were positioned carefully. The former rebels entered the city. Gradually, almost without open confrontation, they were separated from their troops. Once inside and vulnerable, the atmosphere changed. Cesare's men closed around them. Vitellozzo Vitelli was arrested. Oliverotto da Fermo was arrested. Paolo Orsini was seized. So was Francesco Orsini. There was no battlefield, no cavalry charge, no siege, no chance for the captains to gather the soldiers who once made them dangerous. The conspiracy of Magione ended inside a town whose gates they had helped place in Cesare's hands. Vitellozzo seems to have understood what was coming. He had distrusted the reconciliation. Yet he had come anyway. Oliverotto had built his own career through deception and violence. Now he had been trapped by someone more patient than himself. Before the night was over, Vitellozzo and Oliverotto were dead. They were strangled. The two Orsini captives were kept alive a little longer. In Rome, Alexander VI was moving against the wider Orsini family. Father and son were acting in coordination. While Cesare neutralized military captains, Alexander struck at their relatives and political power closer to Rome. Only when Cesare received news that the papal action had advanced did the remaining prisoners become expendable. Paolo Orsini and Francesco, Duke of Gravina, were taken away. In January 1503, they too were strangled. The Magione Conspiracy was finished. The men who believed Cesare was becoming too powerful had attempted to stop him. Instead, they had given him an opportunity to remove several of the commanders most capable of stopping him in the future. The lesson spread quickly. Cesare Borgia could negotiate, smile, promise. And none of those things guaranteed safety. For Niccolò Machiavelli, watching on behalf of Florence, the episode was extraordinary. He had reached Cesare's orbit during the Magione crisis. For months, he watched the Duke negotiate with enemies, recover from apparent weakness, conceal his intentions, rebuild military strength, then destroy the men who betrayed him. Years later, Cesare would appear prominently in The Prince. Not because Machiavelli believed him morally good, that was not the question. Cesare interested him because he offered a living example of how a new ruler might attempt to create authority in a hostile world. He had acquired power partly through the fortune of his father's papacy and the military assistance of France, but once power had been given to him, he worked relentlessly to become less dependent on those who gave it. He removed old ruling families, weakened unreliable mercenary captains, created his own administration, cultivated local support where useful, used severity, reward, deception, and force. But Cesare's success after Senigallia did not stop with revenge. The removal of the conspirators opened new territory. Men who had depended upon the Orsini or Vitelli suddenly found themselves without protection. Other small rulers across central Italy looked at Borgia armies and began making calculations of their own. Some fled, some negotiated, some searched for stronger patrons. For a brief period in early 1503, the Duke of Romagna appeared closer than ever to turning his conquests into something permanent. And this was precisely what frightened his enemies. Because Cesare no longer looked like a temporary military adventurer. He looked like the founder of a principality. The difference mattered. A military adventurer wins a city and loses it when his army leaves. A prince stays, appoints judges, collects taxes, repairs fortresses, creates officials, builds relationships with local elites, punishes rebellion, rewards cooperation, and raises children who might one day inherit what he created. That was the future Cesare wanted. For years, the greatest weakness in the Borgia project had been obvious. Everything depended upon Alexander VI. Cesare knew it, Alexander knew it, their enemies knew it. So Cesare worked to create foundations strong enough to survive the old pope. The Romagna was reorganized, the power of local dynasties broken. Cesare attempted to become less dependent on unreliable condottieri. The French alliance remained useful, but he could not assume Louis XII would support every future Borgia ambition. His position required balance. France could not be allowed to control him. Spain could not be ignored. Florence had to be watched. Venice could become either enemy or opportunity. The Roman barons had to be weakened. And above all, remained the great uncertainty of the papacy. Who would become pope after Alexander? If Alexander could influence the next conclave strongly enough, perhaps Cesare's state would survive. If an enemy became pope, years of conquest could disappear almost overnight. Still, early in 1503, such fears may have seemed manageable. Alexander was not young, but neither did he appear close to death. He had survived political crises that would have destroyed lesser men. Cesare was at the height of his military reputation. Lucrezia was established in Ferrara. The enemies of Magione were dead. The Orsini had suffered heavily. The Romagna obeyed. For perhaps the first time in the family's history, the Borgias possessed more than access to power. They possessed territory. The dream begun by a Valencian lawyer more than half a century earlier had expanded beyond anything Calixtus III could have imagined. Alfonso de Borja entered Rome through law and diplomacy. Rodrigo entered the College of Cardinals through his uncle. Rodrigo survived until he became Alexander VI. Alexander turned his children into political instruments. And Cesare transformed those instruments into armies and provinces. The House of Borgia had reached its summit. But summits are dangerous places. There is nowhere left to climb. Only the possibility of remaining where you are. Or falling. In August 1503, after years of surviving enemies, armies, conspiracies, accusations, and war, the Borgia state encountered an enemy against which neither Alexander's diplomacy nor Cesare's ruthlessness could provide protection. Illness. Rome in summer could be an unhealthy place. Heat settled heavily over the city. Fevers were common. Visitors and residents could become dangerously sick with little warning. In August, Alexander and Cesare both developed severe illness. Almost immediately, another story began growing. Poison. It was perfectly suited to the Borgias. For years, their enemies had connected them with stories of secret poisonings. Now, father and son had fallen sick at almost the same time. Later legend claimed that Alexander and Cesare had intended to poison someone else, only to drink the poison wine themselves by mistake. It was wonderfully dramatic. It was also almost certainly legend. The evidence points much more naturally toward the fever than affecting Rome. Cesare was younger, stronger. His physicians fought to keep him alive. He began to recover. Alexander did not. On the 18th of August, 1503, after more than 11 years as Pope, Alexander VI died. He was 72 years old. The second Borgia papacy was over, and almost immediately, Rome remembered something Cesare always knew. The power of a pope's family lasted only as long as the pope could protect it. There was no son who automatically inherited the Vatican. No crown passed from Alexander's head to Cesare's. The moment Alexander died, the machinery that supported his son's rise stopped belonging to the Borgias, the papal treasury, the authority to deprive rebellious lords of territory, the ability to create cardinals, the ability to negotiate as pope with France, Spain, Venice, Florence, and the empire. All of it now waited for another man. And Cesare was too sick to control events with the energy he desperately needed. Machiavelli would later identify precisely this combination as the catastrophe that destroyed Cesare's plans. Alexander died at the worst possible moment, while Cesare himself was physically unable to act with his usual speed. According to Machiavelli's famous account, Cesare later said that he had prepared for almost everything that might happen when his father died. He had considered enemies, alliances, armies, cardinals, territories, almost every danger. But he had not expected to be nearly dying himself at the exact moment Alexander died. That was the circumstance he failed to prepare for. Across the territories Cesare had conquered, old ruling families saw opportunity. Men driven from Urbino, Perugia, other cities. Families who had waited years for Alexander's death no longer needed to wait. Some returned, others encouraged rebellion. Borgia authority weakened. Rome itself became dangerous. The Orsini had not forgotten what Alexander and Cesare had done. Neither had the Colonna. Armed men gathered. Old rivalries returned. The political world Cesare had temporarily forced into obedience began expanding again the moment his grip loosened. Still, he was not powerless. Even weakened, Cesare possessed troops, strategic fortresses, and influence among Spanish cardinals created during his father's pontificate. The next pope mattered more than any remaining battlefield. If Cesare could secure a friendly pope, he might recover. If an enemy won the conclave, his state might be doomed. The cardinals entered one of the most consequential elections of Cesare's life. The French favored their own candidate. One of the strongest Italian candidates was a man Cesare had every reason to fear, Giuliano della Rovere. Della Rovere had been an enemy of Alexander for years. There could be little doubt that a della Rovere papacy would place Cesare in danger. But the cardinals could not agree. Eventually, they turned toward compromise. Francesco Todeschini Piccolomini. He was respected, elderly, and did not appear strong enough to frighten the great factions. He was elected and took the name Pius III. For Cesare, this was not the worst possible outcome. Pius III confirmed him in important military positions, offering at least temporary breathing space. Perhaps the crisis could still be survived. Cesare began recovering physically. If the new pope remained favorable long enough, he might rebuild, secure the Romagna, reorganize alliances. He had escaped impossible situations before, but Pius III was already seriously ill. His pontificate lasted only weeks. He died in October 1503. Another conclave, another opening, another danger. This time, Giuliano della Rovere was ready. For Cesare, the situation required an uncomfortable calculation. Della Rovere was an old enemy of his father, but Cesare still possessed influence that could matter in the election. If he opposed Della Rovere completely, he risked helping another candidate without gaining anything. If he supported him, perhaps he could purchase something more important than revenge. Survival. Negotiations followed. Della Rovere offered assurances. Cesare's position in the Romagna would be respected, his titles protected. The new pope would not simply destroy everything Alexander built for him. Cesare chose to believe, or at least gamble upon, those promises. He lent support. It would prove one of the most disastrous calculations of his life. Giuliano della Rovere was elected pope. He became Julius II. The name marked a change. Alexander VI had been a politician of extraordinary patience. Julius possessed a different temperament, energetic, militant, determined. He would later become famous as the warrior pope. And he had no intention of allowing Cesare Borgia to preserve a personal principality carved out of papal territory. For Julius, the Romagna belonged to the church, not to the son of the previous pope. At first, Julius did not destroy Cesare immediately. He still needed him. Several fortresses remained controlled by Borgia commanders. Cesare could bargain, but the balance had changed completely. Under Alexander, Cesare negotiated from strength. Now he negotiated while territories rebelled. His father was dead, and the man sitting on the papal throne had spent years opposing the Borgia regime. Promises began disappearing. Julius demanded restoration of papal territory. Cesare resisted. Julius applied pressure. One after another, the foundations of the Borgia state cracked. For Machiavelli, this was the fatal error. Cesare knew that Alexander's successor might destroy him. He knew preventing an enemy from becoming pope was essential. Yet, in the decisive moment, he helped Giuliano della Rovere reach the throne. The prince who deceived conspirators at Senigallia had now allowed himself to depend on the promises of one of his family's oldest enemies. The irony was almost perfect. Cesare built his reputation by understanding that political promises lasted only while useful. Now, his survival depended upon another man treating a promise as permanent. Julius did not. Cesare's situation worsened. He attempted to leave Rome, negotiated with different powers, still possessed the Borgia name, still possessed military experience, but his state was disappearing beneath him. Cities which once feared his return now looked toward the new pope. Commanders reconsidered loyalty. Old dynasties attempted restoration. Alexander's death had not merely removed Cesare's father, it had removed the legal and political architecture that made Borgia expansion possible. Within months, years of conquest were being undone. Cesare eventually moved toward Naples. Perhaps there he could find protection. Perhaps Spanish power could offer what papal power no longer could. Instead, he was arrested. The Duke of Romagna, the man who once commanded armies and trapped enemies inside their own alliances, became a prisoner. The speed of the fall was remarkable. In early 1503, Cesare stood at the center of a growing state. His enemies were dead, his commanders disciplined. Machiavelli watched him as one of the most extraordinary political figures in Italy. By the following year, Alexander was dead. Julius II was pope. The Romagna was slipping away, and Cesare himself was in captivity. This was the weakness hidden inside Borgia greatness from the beginning. Calixtus III raised relatives because he was pope. When he died, most fell. Rodrigo survived because he possessed a church office and decades in which to rebuild. Alexander VI raised Cesare because he was pope. But Cesare had chosen a secular path. There was no cardinal's office waiting for him after his father's death, no permanent institution in which he could simply remain until another opportunity came. His power was territory, and territory had to be defended every day. Without Alexander, he could not defend enough of it. Cesare was eventually sent to Spain. There, the man who once dreamed of creating a central Italian principality found himself confined first at Chinchilla and later in the formidable castle of La Mota at Medina del Campo. Stone walls now surrounded the man who had spent years breaking other people's walls. It might have been the end. For many men, it would have been, but Cesare Borgia was still only around 30. And imprisonment had not removed the quality that carried him from a cardinal's palace to the battlefields of Romagna. He was extraordinarily difficult to contain. In 1506, he escaped. He lowered himself from confinement, was injured during the escape, but managed to reach assistance and eventually make his way north. Toward Navarre, toward the court of King John III, toward a final military career far from Rome, the Vatican, and the state he had once tried to build. For the first time in years, Cesare was free. But freedom did not mean restoration. There was no papal treasury waiting, no French army, no frightened Romagnol city deciding whether to surrender before his artillery arrived. Navarre was a much smaller world than the one Cesare had tried to dominate. It was a kingdom caught between larger powers, its rulers struggling with rebellious nobles and dangerous neighbors. Yet it offered Cesare something he understood very well. War. King John needed military help. Cesare had spent years commanding soldiers. Whatever else had been taken from him, experience remained. And so the man who once dreamed of ruling central Italy became a commander in the service of the King of Navarre. It was a smaller role, but it placed a sword in his hand again. Perhaps Cesare still imagined returning to Italy one day. Perhaps he believed military success could restore enough reputation to begin again. The campaign brought him to Viana. There stood a fortress connected to the rebellion. Navarrese forces laid siege to it. The setting could hardly have been more different from Cesare's years in Italy. No magnificent papal court, no Renaissance palace, no Alexander VI sending instructions from the Vatican. Only soldiers, walls, cold ground, and the familiar uncertainty of siege warfare. On the night of the 12th of March, 1507, men from the fortress attempted to move supplies. Fighting began in darkness. Cesare pursued, and somewhere during the confusion, he became separated from his own troops. It was exactly the sort of decision that might have suited the younger Cesare. Fast, aggressive, personally courageous, and dangerous. This time, no reserve army was close enough to save him. He was surrounded, he fought, and he was killed. The men who struck him down apparently did not initially realize whom they had killed. His body was stripped and left behind. Cesare Borgia was dead at only 31 years of age. There was something almost brutally simple about the ending. Cesare survived one of the most dangerous courts in Europe, abandoned the cardinalate, negotiated with kings, conquered cities, destroyed conspirators, terrified noble families, fascinated Machiavelli. Yet he did not die in a palace conspiracy. He was not poisoned at a banquet. He was not executed by Julius II. He died as a soldier, alone in darkness, separated from his men during a relatively small campaign in Navarre. The state he tried to build did not return. His Italian dream died before him. And with his death, any realistic possibility that Cesare himself might rebuild Borgia power disappeared. But the family had not vanished. Far away in Ferrara, Lucrezia Borgia was living a life that had become almost the opposite of her brother's. Cesare's world narrowed until it ended on a battlefield. Lucrezia's world, after leaving Rome, gradually expanded. Her third husband, Alfonso d'Este, became Duke of Ferrara after the death of his father. Lucrezia therefore became Duchess of one of the most important courts in northern Italy. This did not erase her past. People remembered Rome, Giovanni Sforza, the murdered Alfonso of Aragon, Alexander VI, Cesare. Rumor traveled easily, reputation traveled even faster. Lucrezia arrived carrying the burden of the Borgia name, but Ferrara gave her something Rome rarely had: time. Time to become known for what she actually did, rather than only for what people claimed her family had done. At the Este court, she participated in a sophisticated cultural world. Poets, writers, musicians, diplomats, clerics, courtiers. She managed money, handled correspondence, participated in court life, developed religious and charitable interests. During periods when Alfonso was occupied elsewhere, she could be entrusted with responsibilities connected to the duchy. Her marriage was not a perfect romance. Alfonso d'Este was a practical Renaissance ruler with his own interests, wars, and affairs. Lucrezia had her own emotional world as well, but the marriage survived. That alone made it unlike either of her previous unions. Giovanni Sforza had been discarded. Alfonso of Aragon had been murdered. Alfonso d'Este remained her husband until her death. And through him, Lucrezia finally achieved something the Borgias had struggled to create for decades: a lasting place inside an established hereditary dynasty. There was another difference: children. Lucrezia eventually produced surviving heirs for the Este family. Her son Ercole became the long-awaited male heir and later ruled Ferrara. Another son entered the church. Other children continued the family line. The Borgia blood Alexander had tried to establish through papal power was now moving quietly into one of Italy's oldest ruling houses. No army was required, no conclave, no siege, only inheritance. It was almost the opposite of Cesare's method. Cesare had tried to create permanence through conquest. Lucrezia achieved a form of permanence through family. Her later years, however, were not without suffering. Pregnancy in the 16th century remained dangerous. Lucrezia experienced difficult pregnancies and the loss of children. War also touched Ferrara. The political world of Italy remained unstable. The glittering court life of her earlier Ferrara's years gradually became more restrained. Personal misfortunes and difficulties affecting the Este house drew her toward a quieter and increasingly religious life. This too complicates the legend. The woman remembered for supposed orgies and poison became increasingly devoted to religion. She supported religious institutions, spent time connected with convent life. The final Lucrezia Borgia was far removed from the fictional figure later novels and dramas would make famous. Her final pregnancy came in 1519. It was dangerous. A daughter was born in June. Lucrezia became gravely ill afterward. On the 24th of June, 1519, Lucrezia Borgia died at the age of 39. She had lived less than 4 decades. But consider how many different lives existed inside those years. The daughter of a cardinal, then daughter of a pope, a political bride at 13, a discarded wife, a young woman whose second husband was murdered, a sister to Cesare, a bargaining piece in Alexander's diplomacy, then Duchess of Ferrara, mother of an heir, patron of a Renaissance court, and finally, a woman whose later life became increasingly private and religious. The legend remembered poison. Ferrara remembered something far more human. Of the 4 famous children born to Rodrigo Borgia and Vanozza de Catanei, another brother had lived a much quieter life, Gioffre. He had always been the less dramatic figure. Cesare became the conqueror. Giovanni became the murdered duke. Lucrezia became the famous daughter. Gioffre survived largely because history had given him a quieter role. His marriage to Sancha of Aragon tied him to Naples. After Alexander's death and the collapse of Cesare's power, Gioffre settled under the protection of the Spanish-controlled southern Italian world. Sancha died in 1506. Gioffre later remarried. He had children. Unlike Cesare, he did not attempt to recover Romagna. Unlike Alexander, he did not try to dominate Rome. He remained a southern Italian nobleman until his death. The contrast within a single generation was extraordinary. Giovanni died violently in Rome. Cesare died violently at Viana. Lucrezia died after childbirth in Ferrara. Gioffre died as a landed nobleman in southern Italy. 4 children, 4 very different endings. And Alexander VI, who spent so much energy designing their futures, controlled none of them in the end. Yet even these 4 were not the entire House of Borgia. The family possessed other branches. Most importantly, the Spanish line associated with Gandia continued. Giovanni Borgia's widow had survived the husband pulled from the Tiber in 1497. Through their descendants, the Dukes of Gandia continued the Borgia name in Spain, and from that branch would eventually emerge a Borgia who seemed almost deliberately designed to overturn everything the family name had come to mean. His name was Francisco de Borja. Francis Borgia. He was born in 1510 after Alexander VI was dead and only a few years after Cesare's death. He was the great-grandson of Alexander VI through the Gandia line. He grew up not as the son of a pope's mistress, not as a cardinal general, not as a conqueror of Italian cities. He became a Spanish nobleman. He served at court, became Duke of Gandia, married, had children. Then, after a profound religious transformation and the death of his wife, his direction changed dramatically. He settled his family responsibilities, renounced his ducal position, and entered the Society of Jesus. The House of Borgia had once used the church to climb toward secular power. Francis Borgia turned away from secular power and entered religious life instead. Eventually, he became the 3rd Superior General of the Society of Jesus. Long after his death, the Catholic Church canonized him as a saint named Borgia. The irony could hardly be greater. The same family name generations associated with corruption, lust, poison, violence, and papal scandal would also belong to a canonized Catholic saint. Consider the distance between the 2 men. Alexander VI sat on the papal throne while openly promoting his children. Cesare left the cardinalate to conquer territory, and a descendant of their family later surrendered a duchy to become a Jesuit. The name remained the same. The meaning attached to it had changed completely. Perhaps that alone should make us cautious whenever we try to describe a dynasty with a single word: corrupt, holy, Ruthless, brilliant, scandalous. No family that survives across generations is ever only one thing. And yet, the Borgias would not be remembered primarily because of Francis. They would be remembered because of Alexander, Cesare, and Lucrezia, especially Lucrezia. By the time she died in Ferrara, a second Lucrezia had already begun to emerge beside the real woman, a fictional one. The real Lucrezia had been used repeatedly as a political instrument by her father and brother. She endured an annulled first marriage, lost a second husband killed by men associated with Cesare, eventually built a respected life at the Este court. The fictional Lucrezia was very different. She became a poisoner, a seductress, a participant in incest, a woman who carried death almost as naturally as others carried perfume. The accusations were powerful because they contained everything later audiences wanted from Renaissance scandal: sex, religion, murder, family corruption, a beautiful woman, a wicked pope, a dangerous brother. Once those elements were joined together, the story became almost impossible to resist. One of the earliest sources of the incest accusation came from Giovanni Sforza after Alexander VI forced the annulment of his marriage to Lucrezia. Sforza had been publicly humiliated. The Borgias claimed the marriage had not been consummated. He retaliated with allegations attacking Lucrezia and her family. Those accusations were repeated, expanded, absorbed into the wider anti-Borgia tradition. Modern historical treatments do not regard them as established facts. The poison stories grew in much the same way. Renaissance Italy certainly knew poison. Political murders occurred. Cesare unquestionably employed violence. Alexander VI benefited his family in ways that scandalized contemporaries. There was enough genuine Borgia wrongdoing to make later inventions believable. That is often how powerful legends are created. They do not begin entirely from nothing. They begin with something real. Then rumor fills the empty spaces. A sudden death becomes poisoning. An enemy's accusation becomes testimony. A political marriage becomes sexual conspiracy, and repetition slowly removes uncertainty. Eventually, people stop saying, "It was alleged." They begin saying, "It happened." The mysterious Borgia poison later storytellers called cantarella became part of this tradition. Stories described an almost perfect poison used secretly by Alexander, Cesare, or Lucrezia to remove inconvenient enemies. But the famous image of Lucrezia calmly poisoning those around her belongs much more securely to later legend than to documented evidence about her life. Lucrezia was not the only Borgia transformed by storytelling. Alexander VI became one of history's great images of the corrupt pope. There were genuine reasons for criticism. He openly acknowledged and promoted children, used papal politics to advance family interests. Cesare's territorial state was created with direct support from his father's position. Alexander's pontificate was deeply entangled with dynastic calculation. But Alexander was also an experienced administrator and diplomat who spent decades at the center of church government before his election. To reduce him entirely to secret poisonings and sexual scandal is to replace a complicated political figure with a theatrical villain. The villain is easier to remember. The man is harder. Cesare underwent a different transformation. He did not become merely a villain, he became an idea. Machiavelli had observed him during the most dramatic period of his career, watched him recover from the Magione Conspiracy, watched him deceive the captains who rebelled, watched the trap at Senigallia close. Later, when writing about political power, Machiavelli used Cesare as one of his most important examples of a new ruler attempting to secure a recently acquired state. This gave Cesare an afterlife different from that of his siblings. Giovanni became the murdered brother. Gioffre faded toward the edges of popular memory. Lucrezia became the beautiful poisoner of legend. But Cesare became the Renaissance prince. Cold, calculated, fearless, unpredictable. The man who understood that promises were useful until they were not. That mercy could be strategic, that cruelty could be theatrical, that friendship could be temporary, and that a ruler who depended upon other men's armies was never truly secure. The image was not entirely invented. Cesare had done ruthless things. The deaths at Senigallia were real. His role in the death of Alfonso of Aragon is far more strongly supported than his supposed role in the murder of Giovanni. His conquests were real. His state was real. His political intelligence was real. But even Cesare's legend grew larger than his achievement. He did not create a permanent dynasty, did not become king, did not preserve his state after Alexander's death. He died at 31, fighting far from the Italian territories he once controlled. His career was spectacular and brief. That combination is perfect for legend. A ruler who survives for 40 years eventually becomes complicated. He compromises, grows old, makes boring decisions. Cesare never had time. History froze him while he was still young enough to remain dangerous. And perhaps this is the central reason the Borgias endured so powerfully in cultural memory. Their moment was short. But almost everything happened at once. A Spanish family entered Italy. A cardinal became pope. His children became political instruments. One son was murdered. Another abandoned the church. A daughter married 3 times. A prince was strangled. Cities fell. A conspiracy formed. The conspirators were trapped. A state emerged. Then the pope died. And the entire structure collapsed. It has the shape not merely of history, but of tragedy. Rise, power, overreach, and fall. That pattern is older than the Borgias, but they lived it with extraordinary intensity. Behind all of it was a weakness Alexander VI never truly solved. The family could acquire power. It could not make that power hereditary enough. This had been the problem from the beginning. Calixtus III became pope. His relatives rose. Calixtus died. Most of their power disappeared. Rodrigo survived, spent decades rebuilding, eventually became Alexander VI. Alexander raised Cesare. Cesare conquered territory, but Alexander died before the new state had become independent enough to survive without him. The Borgias repeatedly climbed through the papacy, and the papacy could never simply be inherited by a son. That was the contradiction at the heart of their dynasty. They tried to use an elective religious monarchy as the foundation for hereditary family power. For a while, Alexander and Cesare came remarkably close. But close was not enough. There is another irony. Some families Cesare defeated ultimately survived politically longer than his principality. The Este remained in Ferrara for generations after Lucrezia entered their house. Her son succeeded his father and continued the dynasty. The Borgias conquered quickly. The Este endured. And Lucrezia, the Borgia who escaped Rome rather than conquering it, may ultimately have secured a more lasting dynastic legacy than Cesare did with all his armies. She did it quietly, through marriage, children, court life, and survival. Perhaps Alexander would have appreciated the result. Perhaps Cesare would not. The Borgia blood also remained in Spain. Gandia continued. Francis Borgia became the most striking religious figure of the later family. Through such branches, the House of Borgia did not vanish when its Roman Empire collapsed. What vanished was something more specific. A moment. The extraordinary years when almost every major political road in Italy seemed to lead back toward Alexander VI and his children. That moment lasted only a little more than a decade. Yet 5 centuries later, it still overshadows generations of Borgias who lived afterward. Perhaps that is the price of becoming legendary. The loudest chapter makes the quieter ones disappear. And so, as our long story comes toward its end, return for a moment to where it began. Not Rome, not the Vatican, not Cesare's battlefield. Valencia. A family called Borja. A young man named Alfonso who studied law. He could not have known what would follow. He could not have known that he would become Pope Calixtus III. He could not have known that the nephew he helped into the church would wait more than 30 years and become Alexander VI. Alexander could not have known, when his children were young, that Giovanni would die in the Tiber, that Cesare would abandon the cardinalate, that Lucrezia would become Duchess of Ferrara, that Gioffre would quietly continue his life in southern Italy. Cesare could not have known, while watching banners above his newly conquered cities, that within a few years he would die far away in Navarre. And Lucrezia could not have known, while being sent into her first marriage as a girl, that centuries later strangers would still argue over whether she had been monster, victim, survivor, or something between them all. History is rarely as clean as legend wants it to be. The Borgias were not innocent. They were not demons. They were a family operating inside one of the most competitive political systems of Renaissance Europe. They used marriage, money, church offices, diplomacy, military force, deception, and, at times, murder. Their enemies used many of the same tools, but the Borgias were unusually visible, unusually successful for a short time, foreign in the eyes of many Italians, and connected to the papacy in a way that made every private scandal public. When they fell, their enemies wrote. When those enemies died, later writers continued. Eventually, the legend became strong enough to live without them. That may be the greatest Borgia achievement of all. Not the papacy, not the Romagna, not Gandia, not Ferrara. Memory. A state can disappear. A fortress can collapse. A family palace can change hands. But a story repeated for 500 years becomes its own kind of inheritance. And so, the House of Borgia remains. In histories of Renaissance Rome, in biographies of popes, in studies of Machiavelli, in the memory of Ferrara, in the story of St. Francis Borgia, and in novels, paintings, plays, operas, films, and television dramas that continue rebuilding the family for each new generation. But tonight, we have tried to leave the legend slightly quieter, not to remove it. The legend is part of the story now, only to place the people behind it again. Alfonso, the lawyer who became pope, Rodrigo, who learned to wait, Giovanni, the favored son whose murder was never solved, Cesare, the cardinal who wanted a sword, Lucrezia, the daughter repeatedly traded through marriage who built a new identity in Ferrara, Gioffre, the brother who survived outside the brightest light, and Francis, the descendant who carried the Borgia name in an entirely different direction. One house, many lives, and no single judgment large enough to contain them all. The halls are quiet now. The armies that once crossed the Romagna have been gone for centuries. The voices inside Alexander's Vatican have faded. The rooms in which marriages were negotiated belong to another age. The gates of conquered cities no longer open at the sight of Cesare's banners. Along the Tiber, water continues to move beneath Rome, just as it did on the night Giovanni Borgia disappeared. Far to the north, Ferrara still remembers the court in which Lucrezia spent the final years of her life. Far to the west, Spain still carries the memory of the family from which these extraordinary lives emerged. And somewhere between the facts and the rumors, between the documents and the legends, the Borgias remain suspended. Not quite heroes, not quite monsters. Simply human beings given unusual opportunities and unusual temptations. They rose because they understood power. They fell because power borrowed from one man could not last forever. They became infamous because some of the accusations against them were true enough to make the false ones believable. And they became unforgettable because their real history was already dramatic enough that legend barely needed an invitation. So now, allow the names to drift away. Alexander, Cesare, Lucrezia, Giovanni, Gioffre. The rooms grow darker, the candles burn lower. Outside, the streets of Renaissance Rome become still. There are no more messengers climbing palace stairs, no more cardinals gathering behind closed doors, no more armies waiting beyond the city walls, no marriage left to negotiate, no fortress left to take, no conspiracy left to uncover, only an old family name, and the long echo of a story that refused to disappear. Let that echo grow softer now. Let Rome fade into the distance. Let the palaces, battlefields, churches, fortresses, and candlelit rooms dissolve quietly into the dark. And if you have followed the Borgias all the way from Valencia to the Vatican, from the Romagna to Ferrara, from imprisonment in Spain to the final battlefield at Viana, then the journey is finished. The family may remain in history, but you do not need to remain awake for them. The doors of the great house are closing. The last light disappears beneath them. Everything is quiet. For tonight, the Borgias can finally rest, and so can you. Good night.